Howdy ho and welcome to Rauta's opinion video. That is worst to best kind. This time the band in question, as you can see, is Pantera. I know it's a little bit unexpected, as many people think that Rauta is all about black metal or black and death metal. But to be honest, no metal is too holy or unholy for that matter for Rauta's content. And as far as goes to my personal history, yes, I've enjoyed Pantera throughout the years. Even though, let's be honest about it, my love with Pantera doesn't really have the long arc, the whole discography of the band, but actually is focused on the very, very few years. But those years are very important because there's a lot of nostalgia in play. That is the formative years, so to speak. The teenage years when, your music taste is ready to just, kind of suck in every possible kind of a good band. Doesn't matter what kind of a genre it is. Before you kind of is more defined, like, rivers in a dry land, if you get the metaphor right here. Anyhow, because Pantera hasn't been active for a long time, for dramatic reasons, this is very, very fitting band for worst to best kind videos here on Rauta. And now that I got to mention it, only a few, very, very few bands have ended so tragically as Pantera. I mean, really, if you think about throughout the whole metal history, well, most bands are disbanded because people just kind of got bored of it, or because they got just, wanted to do something else. But there are bands where a certain key member has deceased, died because of various reasons, mostly illness and all that stuff, but also there are bands with, suicide and shit like that. But Pantera has actually two key members dead. That is very, very tragic. It's no sarcasm here whatsoever. First of all, Dimebag Darrell, the kind of a key figure of the band, guitarist of the band. I mean, he was shot on stage. I can't really figure out more tragic ending to a band. I mean, accidents are bad, suicides are bad. But when you get killed on stage because you kind of abandoned your previous bands or whatever reasoning there was to the shooting, I mean, the real reason, you can't really end a batch more tragic ways than that. I mean, there was no even chance of reunion or comeback or whatever. And of course, the other key member, drummer Willie Paul, deceased many years later. His death wasn't that sense of a tragic, but tragic nonetheless. So two members, original ones even, deceased. There is no comeback for this kind of a band. So it's a really, really tragic ending. And as it seems, I think this is something where timeline kind of gets twisted and all that. Pantera didn't exist more than actually 20 years and then some. I mean, there's a lot of bands you feel like have been here on eternity, like 30 years, 40 years, and stuff like that. Even bands like Emperor, which lasted only 10 years, seems like they have been there forever. But, time kind of gets twisted when you really look at the history, and unless you really take at the numbers, well, then it's kind of a more, aware how things go. But enough rattle and babble. Let's go to Pantera discography page here, Metal Archives, because this needs kind of a little bit of recap. Now, there's lots of bands which just stayed constantly on the same genre. I mean, bands like Emperor, even though they changed style, and it's always been black metal. There are bands that, like Iron Maiden, who have been doing more than 40 years of pretty heavy metal. Very consistent in style, very logical in that sense. And then there are bands like Pantera that actually changed style quite dramatically. I mean, it's a drastic change from where they started. And let's be honest about it once again. I entered Pantera game with Cowboys from Hell. So it was for me early 90s when I got to listen to the Pantera. Can't really remember exact year, can't even remember which was my first album, but probably Vulgar Display of Power. That is just likely, because it was roughly probably 1992, 1993 or whatsoever, but it might have been before that. Can't really put my finger on it. So there's that. So one of those many people who got into Pantera got to like their, because later on, so-called groove metal. And I'll get that in a bit. And then people just forget that the first 4 albums were actually quite something different, especially the 3 ones. They had nothing to do with groove metal or even thrash metal, which is the key part here. And that's how Pantera ended. I mean, they kind of changed to what it was known as Pantera's groove metal, and that was pretty much the rest of it. But 4 first albums were quite different, and the 4 last ones. So there's a big, like a dividing line in the band's history. First, roughly 10 years, little less than that, was exactly something else. One could say it's hard rock, one could say it's kind of a glam metal. Doesn't really matter which way you go. There is a lot of both camps going on. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of a Mötley Crüe kind of a thing going on with the early one, and later on, well, they figured out they wanted to do something more masculine, I guess. Definitely something more powerful, not so media sexy, and that is the irony of it. That made them successful. Pantera was really, really big back in the 90s especially. And by the time they ended with, Reinventing the Steel, 2000, I mean, that was the last studio album anyway, it was a very, very different band. But before we go into the worst to best, there's something I really need to discuss. It was only like after 30 years of listening to Pantera, more or less, that I figured out it's only because of very, very little nuanced things, because that Pantera isn't called a thrash metal things. Now a lot of people are like, what the fuck are you talking about? And let me explain. Now, if you really think about it, thrash metal genre is like this small a box compared to death metal, which is roughly many times that, compared to black metal, which is 10 again. I mean, black metal, you can go all the way from atmospheric and very melodic parts to very raw and primitive stuff. And you have something in between, which is a kind of typical black metal. You have all kind of suicidal black metal, depressive kind. You have very symphonic, orchestrated black metal, like Dimmu Borgir and Emperor and stuff like that. And nobody's pitching like, hey, this band over here, which is very melodic and atmospheric and stuff like that, isn't like different genre than bands like Ilion or whatever, Swordwalker. But when you come to thrash metal, you're kind of like, you have to do certain things in a certain set of rules, or you're out of the game, you're out of the whole genre. Even death metal is forgiving with its so-called melodic death metal parts or brutal death metal stuff and stuff like that. You kind of need to have certain kind of riffs and growly or vocals. Not even that if you really think about melodic death metal. But those are way more forgiving than thrash metal. Because if you really think about it, there's a lot of riffs with Pantera, and I mean the later years especially, where the riffs are something that could be seen as a cornerstone of thrash metal. However, Pantera wasn't even considered thrash metal, really. Never in my history, when I remember talking about Pantera, nobody was saying like, hey, Pantera is technically speaking a thrash metal band of a different kind. If you really think about some of the solos or guitar riffs or, those palm muted riffs or whatever, there's a lot in common with bands like Metallica and the like. There is definitely overlapping with a lot of ideas. So, have we been true in an alternate history? I think Pantera could have been really called thrash metal, and groove metal would be much like the melodic death metal to, well, death metal, whereas, groove metal would be kind of a thrash metal, but a little bit of a different kind of grooviness. Well, end of rant about it. Just my opinion about it. I kind of wanted to get out of my head because really going through this whole discography made me think Pantera in a way should be called thrash metal band. It's not the same as Exodus or Slayer, but then again, neither has been bands like Metallica been since the four albums and so forth. Anyway, this is my take on Pantera. A very unique band, very big influence to many kind of bands. I guess they can be blamed and thanked for so-called groove metal, partially anyway, because they kind of made their own way. They paved their own way with the kind of a Texas kind of style. And I think I'm very thankful for that, even though I only love basically like 2 albums of the whole deal, and the rest not so much. And then there are bands, albums which are not even close to being good. There are a couple of good ones in my opinion. With Pantera, a couple of great ones, and then there's a couple of kind of boring ones. 3 actually. Anyway, very, very interesting bands because first with Metal Magic, 1983, and followed by Project in the Jungle and I'm the Night to 1985. I mean, they were just kind of a melodic glam metal. Kind of a hard rock, really, if you think about it. And man, they are not good. Especially Metal Magic is kind of equivalent of, Pantera's equivalent to what Celtic Frost was doing with Cold Lake. Really like, what the hell? Except that these guys started with that. And I've gone through a lot of letters comparing how some kind of bands go with their career. Sometimes it's a W, sometimes it's an M, or N, or U, or Y, things like that. Well, not Y, but you get the idea. I mean, bands start good and they're going to go down, only to go up again, like U letter, or J, starting with relatively good, then going up, and then going really high up. Once again, Pantera is more complicated than that, but technically speaking, there is a peak moment in the band's career and then their low points. And after these 3 albums, power metal kind of changed the way. I mean, it's the kind of a missing link between, not missing so much, but anyway, the link between Cowboys from Hell and I'm the Night. Well, Cowboys from Hell is clearly the start for this kind of a groove metal, if you will, or thrash metal, or alternative thrash metal, if you really think about it. And since then, it has been a different band. Power metal is the link between the first phase and the, well, so-called second phase. It's a kind of a hybrid. Man, there are lots of bands, Edge of Sanity, which I previously featured on Worst to Best, which kind of have the same kind of a transition phases between different styles. But whereas Edge of Sanity has arguably 3 different phases, Pantera, technically speaking, has 2. Because I don't really call power metal a phase, it's more like a transition part. What I could say, it's a phase, but yeah, let's not argue about that. But for 8 different albums with a couple of different styles, which way could it really go? Now, if I'm going to say my worst to best, I'm going to say Metal Magic is the least good. I think it's actually subpar, less than mediocre of an album. So I'm pretty much agreeing what Metalog have said with 14 reviews and 47%. I would say it's a kind of a 5 out of 10 album. It's kind of a badish glam album. Then again, it's a kind of a typical 1980s first album. Not really there yet. And the band members are pretty much figuring out what to do and blah, blah, blah. It's not recommended to listen to unless you're going to a discography run much like me. Then Project in the Jungle continues with the very same style. And I Am the Night is exactly, once again, doing the same style, but taking a little bit evolution here. I would say those 3 albums are, in my opinion, the worst of Pantera, and actually by that order. Maybe I could say Project in the Jungle, in that respect, would go higher than I Am the Night, because technically speaking, I Am the Night doesn't really change the game that much, especially for quality. Some people disagree with me, but I'm saying they're pretty much a 6 out of 10. Then it gets more complicated, because suddenly power metal is way more metallic an album, and actually presenting some new ideas, and I'm like, wow, this is kind of cool. But I would still put it into low 4, because it's not really a good album, but it's definitely way more metallic. Which is kind of interesting that they have rated it 88% by 515 reviews, considering it's a little bit of mix and match. I guess that speaks for itself. Some people really, really like it. For me, it's kind of a 7. But it's not there yet. And then it gets complicated, because by the time those 4 first albums are done, like, which direction would I go? Would I keep going in the chronological order, or would I go a little bit different? And the answer is the latter one. I would go different. Let's be honest about it. Cowboys from Hell has a little bit of a nostalgic bonus for me, because there's some great tunes like Cemetery Gates, title track, etc. So there's definitely way more metallic output. There's some really great ideas here and there, but there's also quite a lot of filler songs. So I wouldn't pick that one, but instead I would say Reinventing the Steel from 2000 would be taking the spot number 5. That is from worst to the best. So by the time you're halfway through, I would say Reinventing the Steel is the 4th best album, if you want to take on the positive side. It definitely has this kind of a later on Pantera Grooviness. Basically the same stuff that pretty much started with Vulgar Display of Power, continued by Far Beyond Driven, then Greater and Sadder and Threadkill. But Reinventing the Steel is almost like a cover band of Pantera. I mean, basically sounding the same. You have Phil Anselmo's unique trademark vocals. You have the riffs and the drumming, but the songs don't have passion. They don't have that much of a good riffs. It's more like some recycled or maybe leftover material, which is there to just like, hey, let's do another Pantera album. Not so much a great swan song, but listenable definitely. Actually, it's quite good in terms of groove metal genre, but for a Pantera album, not so much. So that's why it is here. That's the 4th best album. And now it's narrowed down. No, sorry, the 5th best album, obviously, because now it's narrowed down to 4 best albums. That is Cowboys from Hell, Vulgar Display of Power, Far Beyond Driven, and The Great Southern Threadkill. And that's where it gets complicated, because in my opinion, there are albums that's kind of like having a hard fight. Would I go for Cowboys from Hell, which is still a little bit unfinished in terms of Pantera's peak point, but it's kind of a new. And then there's an album called The Great Southern Threadkill, which is basically, continuing with the best albums in my opinion, I would say The Great Southern Threadkill takes the 4th spot, because the thing here is, it's not as good as Far Beyond Driven or Vulgar Display of Power. It's almost like, in quality-wise, challenging Cowboys from Hell, but not having the kind of a greatness in it. So, in a way, it could be better than Cowboys from Hell. But, in my opinion, this is where the nostalgia plays comes into play. I had my teenage years experiences with Cowboys from Hell. Once again, those songs I mentioned, where I did not have that with, Great Southern Threadkill. I mean, there are some good songs with it, but it's still lacking the some kind of a magic that the 2 previous albums had it. So, The Great Southern Threadkill would take the spot number 4, which narrows us once again to top 3, and that's where Cowboys from Hell come into play. There's a lot of good songs, and there are lots of filler songs, kind of like 50-50, which is the reason why I would say 7.5 out of 10. Not exactly good as 8, but definitely on the gooder side, because there is definitely good production, good vocals, good songwriting, lots of variety, and it's already defined the Pantera sound and style. So it's a good album, definitely, but not that good. And then there is this big step up with Vulgar Display of Power and, in my opinion, Far Beyond Driven, which are both, in my books, 8.5 out of 10. Not exactly 9ers, but close to it. And I had hard times figuring out, because these are both the albums from 1992 and 1994, the definite Pantera albums for me. That was where the band, in my opinion, peaked. They had the most energy. They played great live shows, seen them a couple of times back in the days. Actually, Far Beyond Driven tour in Finland, 1994, or 1995 roughly. Anyway, they peaked. They had great shows, they had great songs, great albums and all that stuff. So I'm kind of like balancing between these two. But I would say Far Beyond Driven takes the spot number 2. It's basically as good as Vulgar Display of Power in my books. But then again, when I was figuring out which actually has more better songs and which has least fillers, I would say that's Vulgar. Vulgar is Display of Power, being the best Pantera album, 1992, 30 years ago. That is the really good one. I mean, there is no weak songs really. I love Hello. I love By Demons Be Driven. I love Rise, This Love, Fucking Hostile, Walk, A New Level, Mouth of War. That doesn't really leave lots of songs that I don't really love that much. Maybe the No Good, Live in a Hole, or Regular People. I mean, they're all good, but those 3 would be the least good of the whole deal here. So given that this almost 53 minutes of an album is mostly done by good or even great songs, man, can't really complain. So what an interesting band Pantera was. I am kind of sorry for people who never got to see them live. They were good. And it's a shame they had this tragic ending. I wish they could have just decided, okay, we're going to end it and we're going to do something else, but that was out of choice. I mean, technically speaking, they had quit before these tragic events happened, but there was obviously always, theoretically speaking, a room for a reunion, a comeback and stuff like that. So Pantera could have been back. They could have been back better than where they left off with Reinventing the Steel, but they were never given a chance. So we never know. Anyway, interesting band and definitely a cornerstone band for groove metal or alternative thrash metal, as I like to call it. And I think people should give it a chance, even if you skip the first 4 or 3 ones and continue from Cowboys from Hell, basically. A really, really interesting band, very powerful at its peak point. So definitely a classic band in so many ways. And I still consider the best albums as classic albums, obviously. So give it a chance. This is my take on worst to best. What is your worst to best with Pantera? Let me know in the comment section, and I hope you give this band a new chance with this video. So take care and see you soon with more videos coming away.